The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, watching the Seattle skyline fade into dusk. From my window, I could see the Space Needle piercing the gray October sky, its observation deck glowing like a beacon against the approaching storm clouds. It was a view I'd earned through 15 years of dedicated service to Cascade Pharmaceuticals, climbing from a junior research analyst to senior vice president of clinical development. But tonight, as I stared at the city below, I knew this would be one of the last times I'd see it from this particular vantage point. My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and at 41 years old, I thought I understood the pharmaceutical industry. I'd spent my career developing life-saving medications, overseeing clinical trials that brought hope to millions of patients worldwide. I'd published papers in prestigious medical journals, spoken at international conferences, and built a reputation as one of the most ethical and thorough clinical researchers in the field. What I hadn't expected was to discover that my own company, the company I devoted my professional life to, was systematically falsifying clinical trial data to hide dangerous side effects from a drug that could kill thousands of people. The discovery had come 3 weeks ago, buried in a routine data review for our latest blockbuster medication, Nuraxin. It was supposed to be a revolutionary treatment for Alzheimer's disease, promising to slow cognitive decline and give families precious additional years with their loved ones. The FDA approval process had been fast-tracked due to the urgent need for effective Alzheimer's treatments, and Cascade had invested over $2 billion in its development. The drug was set to launch in 6 months, with projected annual revenues of $15 billion. But the data I'd uncovered told a different story. Hidden in encrypted files that I'd accessed during a routine security audit, I found evidence that Nuraxin caused severe cardiac complications in approximately 8% of patients, a side effect that had been systematically removed from all official trial reports. The original data showed that 63 patients had died during clinical trials, not the 12 deaths that had been reported to the FDA. The cover-up went all the way to the top, orchestrated by CEO Marcus Blackwood and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Patricia Vance, the woman I'd considered a mentor for the past decade. The betrayal cut deeper than any professional disappointment I'd ever experienced. Dr. Vance had recruited me personally from Johns Hopkins, promising me the opportunity to make a real difference in patients' lives. She'd been my advocate, my guide, and my friend. I trusted her completely, believing that we shared the same commitment to scientific integrity and patient safety. To discover that she'd been systematically falsifying data while preaching about ethical research standards felt like a knife to the heart. But it wasn't just personal betrayal that motivated me. It was the knowledge that thousands of Alzheimer's patients would die if Nuraxin reached the market. These were vulnerable people, desperate for any treatment that might slow their cognitive decline. They trusted pharmaceutical companies to provide safe, effective medications. They trusted doctors like me to ensure that clinical trials were conducted with absolute integrity. That trust was sacred, and Cascade Pharmaceuticals was about to violate it in the most heinous way possible. I'd spent the past 3 weeks documenting everything, copying files, recording conversations, and building an airtight case against the company that had been my professional home for 15 years. I'd consulted with attorneys, contacted investigative journalists, and prepared detailed reports for the FDA, the Department of Justice, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. But I knew that blowing the whistle would end my career in the pharmaceutical industry. Marcus Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in biotech, with connections throughout the regulatory agencies and academic institutions. He would ensure that I never worked in pharmaceuticals again. That's when I decided that simply exposing the fraud wasn't enough. If Cascade Pharmaceuticals wanted to destroy lives for profit, then I would destroy them first. But I wouldn't do it through regulatory agencies or criminal investigations. Those processes could take years, and Nuraxin might reach the market before justice was served. Instead, I would use my position, my knowledge, and my reputation to bring down the entire company from the inside. The plan I developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Cascade's stock price was built on the promise of Nuraxin's success. The company had borrowed heavily to fund the drug's development, and their entire financial future depended on its successful launch. If I could systematically undermine confidence in Nuraxin while simultaneously exposing the company's fraudulent practices, I could trigger a complete collapse of Cascade's market value. The company would face bankruptcy, criminal investigations, and civil lawsuits that would destroy it completely. But timing was everything. I needed to coordinate my attack carefully, ensuring maximum damage while protecting myself from retaliation. I'd already transferred copies of all incriminating evidence to secure offshore servers, established contact with whistleblower protection attorneys, and prepared detailed testimony for multiple regulatory agencies. Now I needed to execute the final phase of my plan, the systematic destruction of Cascade Pharmaceuticals' reputation and financial stability. The first step had been to identify key investors and analysts who followed Cascade's stock. I'd spent weeks building relationships with financial journalists, short sellers, and institutional investors who would be interested in evidence of fraud at a major pharmaceutical company. I'd carefully leaked selected pieces of information, always maintaining plausible deniability while gradually building a narrative of corporate malfeasance. The financial press was already asking uncomfortable questions about Nuraxin's clinical trial data, and several major investors had quietly begun reducing their positions in Cascade stock. The second step involved my colleagues in the clinical development department. I'd identified several other researchers who had expressed private concerns about Nuraxin's safety profile but had been silenced by Dr. Vance and her team. These were good people, ethical scientists who had been pressured to compromise their principles for the sake of corporate profits. I'd begun reaching out to them individually, sharing selected pieces of evidence and encouraging them to document their own concerns. Several had already contacted attorneys and were preparing their own whistleblower complaints. The third step was the most dangerous, directly confronting the executives responsible for the fraud. I'd requested a meeting with Dr. Vance and Marcus Blackwood, ostensibly to discuss concerns about Nuraxin's safety profile. They'd agreed to meet with me, probably assuming they could intimidate me into silence or buy my cooperation with promises of promotion and increased compensation. They had no idea that I'd already documented their crimes and was prepared to destroy them both. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing my notes one final time, I thought about the oath I'd taken when I became a physician. First, do no harm. Cascade Pharmaceuticals was about to harm thousands of innocent people for the sake of corporate profits. Dr. Vance and Marcus Blackwood had violated every principle of medical ethics, betrayed the trust of patients and colleagues, and corrupted the scientific process that was supposed to protect public health. They deserved everything that was about to happen to them. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning in Marcus Blackwood's executive conference room. It was a space designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a massive mahogany table that could seat 20 people, and walls lined with awards and photographs of Blackwood with various politicians and celebrities. I'd been in this room dozens of times over the years, usually for celebrations of successful drug approvals or presentations of quarterly financial results. Today, it would serve as the setting for the most important confrontation of my career. Dr. Vance was already seated when I arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression carefully neutral. At 62, she was still an imposing figure, tall, elegant, and possessed of the kind of intellectual authority that had made her one of the most respected clinical researchers in the country. Or at least, she had been respected before I'd discovered the truth about her involvement in the Nuraxin fraud. Marcus Blackwood entered a few minutes later, his presence filling the room with the kind of aggressive energy that had made him a billionaire before his 50th birthday. He was shorter than he appeared in photographs, but his personality was larger than life, the kind of man who dominated every conversation and never doubted his own brilliance. He'd built Cascade Pharmaceuticals from a small biotech startup into one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and his ego was proportional to his success. "Elena," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Patricia tells me you have some concerns about Nuraxin. I have to say I'm surprised. The clinical data has been thoroughly reviewed by our entire team, and the FDA has expressed complete confidence in the drug's safety profile." I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. "I think you'll find my concerns are well-founded," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I've discovered some discrepancies in the clinical trial data that I believe require immediate attention. The first slide I displayed showed the original clinical trial results, the real data that had been hidden from the FDA. 63 deaths, hundreds of serious cardiac events, and clear evidence that Nuraxin posed unacceptable risks to patients. Dr. Vance's face went pale, and Marcus Blackwood's expression shifted from confident to concerned. "Where did you get this data?" Dr. Vance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the encrypted servers that you thought were secure," I replied. "I've been conducting a comprehensive audit of our clinical trial databases, and I've uncovered systematic evidence of data manipulation, falsification of safety reports, and deliberate concealment of adverse events." Marcus Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Elena, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. These files appear to be corrupted or incomplete. The official trial data has been thoroughly validated by independent auditors." I advanced to the next slide, which showed email communications between Dr. Vance and several clinical research coordinators. The messages were explicit in their instructions to remove adverse events from official reports and to reclassify deaths as unrelated to the study drug. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. These were clear instructions to commit fraud. "There's no misunderstanding, Marcus," I said, using his first name deliberately to signal that I was no longer intimidated by his authority. "You and Patricia have been systematically falsifying clinical trial data for the past 2 years. You've hidden evidence of serious side effects that could kill thousands of patients. You've lied to the FDA, to investors, and to the medical community." Dr. Vance finally found her voice. "Elena, you don't understand the complexity of clinical trial data analysis. These adverse events were thoroughly investigated and determined to be unrelated to Nuraxin. The deaths you're referring to were due to underlying medical conditions, not the study drug." I displayed the next slide, which showed the original investigator reports, documents that clearly attributed the deaths and cardiac events to Nuraxin exposure. These reports had been written by the clinical investigators themselves, before being altered by Cascade's data management team. "The original investigators disagreed with your assessment," I said. "In fact, several of them raised serious concerns about Nuraxin's safety profile and recommended that the trials be halted. Those recommendations were ignored, and the investigators were pressured to change their reports." Marcus Blackwood stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is enough. Elena, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I won't tolerate these baseless accusations. If you have concerns about our clinical data, there are proper channels for addressing them. This kind of grandstanding is unprofessional and potentially libelous." I remained seated, my voice calm and measured. "I've already addressed my concerns through the proper channels, Marcus. I've filed detailed complaints with the FDA, the Department of Justice, and the SEC. I've provided them with comprehensive evidence of fraud, including the documents I'm showing you now. I've also shared this information with several investigative journalists and short-selling firms who specialize in exposing pharmaceutical fraud." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Vance stared at me with a mixture of shock and betrayal, while Marcus Blackwood's face cycled through various shades of red and purple. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he calculated the potential damage to the company and his personal reputation. "You have no idea what you've done," he said finally, his voice low and threatening. "Cascade Pharmaceuticals employs 15,000 people. We're on the verge of bringing a revolutionary Alzheimer's treatment to market. You're going to destroy all of that based on your misinterpretation of complex clinical data." I stood up and began packing my laptop. "I'm going to prevent you from killing thousands of innocent patients for the sake of corporate profits. Nuraxin is dangerous, and you know it. You've known it for 2 years, and you've chosen to hide that information from the people who have the right to make informed decisions about their medical care." Dr. Vance finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Elena, please. We can work this out. There might be ways to address the safety concerns without destroying the entire program. Think about all the patients who could benefit from Nuraxin. Think about the years of research that have gone into this drug." I paused at the door and looked back at her. "I am thinking about the patients, Patricia. I'm thinking about the 8% who will die from cardiac complications. I'm thinking about their families, who will trust that Naraxin is safe because the FDA approved it. I'm thinking about the doctors who will prescribe it in good faith, not knowing that you've hidden critical safety information. Marcus Blackwood slammed his hand on the table. This conversation is over. Elena, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you'll be hearing from our attorneys about the theft of proprietary information and violation of your confidentiality agreements. I smiled for the first time since entering the room. Actually, Marcus, I resigned 3 weeks ago. My attorney filed the paperwork with HR this morning, along with my formal whistleblower complaint. As for the theft of proprietary information, I think you'll find that exposing criminal activity is protected under federal whistleblower statutes. I left them sitting in stunned silence and walked calmly to the elevator. As the doors closed behind me, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced since discovering the fraud. The first phase of my plan was complete. Cascade's executives now knew that their crimes had been exposed and that the evidence was already in the hands of multiple regulatory agencies and journalists. But the real destruction was just beginning. Within hours of my meeting with Blackwood and Dr. Vance, the first news reports began appearing. The Wall Street Journal published a detailed expose of Naraxin's hidden safety data, complete with leaked documents and interviews with former clinical investigators. The story was picked up by major news networks, medical journals, and financial publications around the world. Cascade's stock price plummeted by 40% in after-hours trading. The FDA announced an immediate investigation into Naraxin's clinical trial data and suspended the drug's approval process pending a comprehensive review. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into potential fraud charges against Cascade executives. The SEC launched its own investigation into possible securities violations related to the company's failure to disclose material safety information to investors. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: Cascade's own employees. The clinical researchers I'd been quietly encouraging to document their concerns came forward en masse, providing additional evidence of the systematic data manipulation. Several senior executives resigned rather than face potential criminal charges. The company's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss Marcus Blackwood's future as CEO. Within a week, Cascade Pharmaceuticals was in free fall. The company's stock price had lost 70% of its value, wiping out nearly $50 billion in market capitalization. Major institutional investors were dumping their shares, and several class action lawsuits had been filed on behalf of shareholders who claimed they'd been defrauded by the company's false statements about Naraxin's safety. Marcus Blackwood was forced to resign as CEO, though he continued to deny any wrongdoing. Dr. Vance was terminated and stripped of her medical license pending the outcome of criminal investigations. The company was forced to halt all clinical trials and lay off thousands of employees as it struggled to survive the financial and legal fallout. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months later, when I testified before a congressional committee investigating pharmaceutical fraud. Sitting at the witness table, facing a panel of senators and representatives, I detailed the systematic corruption I'd uncovered at Cascade Pharmaceuticals. The hearing was broadcast live on national television, and my testimony was covered extensively by the media. "Dr. Rodriguez," asked Senator Margaret Chin, the committee's chairwoman, "in your professional opinion, how many patients could have been harmed if Naraxin had reached the market?" I looked directly into the camera, knowing that millions of people were watching. Based on the clinical trial data, approximately 8% of patients taking Naraxin would have experienced serious cardiac complications. With projected annual sales of $15 billion and an estimated patient population of 2 million people, we could have seen as many as 160,000 serious adverse events and potentially 16,000 deaths per year. The committee room was silent as the implications of those numbers sank in. 16,000 preventable deaths, all for the sake of corporate profits. And in your opinion, Senator Chun continued, was Cascade Pharmaceuticals' leadership aware of these risks? Absolutely, I replied. The evidence clearly shows that CEO Marcus Blackwood and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Patricia Vance were directly involved in the decision to hide safety data from the FDA and the medical community. They knew that Naraxin was dangerous, and they chose to pursue approval anyway. The hearing marked the beginning of the end for Cascade Pharmaceuticals. Within 6 months, The company had filed for bankruptcy, unable to survive the combination of legal settlements, regulatory fines, and loss of investor confidence. Marcus Blackwood and Dr. Vance were both indicted on federal fraud charges and eventually sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But perhaps the most important outcome was the impact on pharmaceutical industry practices. My case became a landmark example of the importance of whistleblower protections and the need for independent oversight of clinical trials. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of data manipulation that had occurred at Cascade, and several other pharmaceutical companies voluntarily disclosed previously hidden safety data rather than risk similar exposure. As I sat in my new office at the University of Washington, where I'd accepted a position as Director of Clinical Research Ethics, I reflected on the events of the past year. I'd lost my career in the pharmaceutical industry, faced death threats from Cascade loyalists, and endured months of legal battles and media scrutiny. But I'd also prevented a dangerous drug from reaching the market and potentially saved thousands of lives. The view from my university office wasn't as impressive as the one I'd had at Cascade. Just a modest view of the campus quad and the students hurrying between classes. But it represented something more valuable than corporate prestige or financial success. It represented the opportunity to train the next generation of clinical researchers, to instill in them the ethical principles that should guide medical research, and to ensure that the kind of fraud I'd uncovered at Cascade would never happen again. On my desk sat a letter from the family of Margaret Thompson, an 83-year-old woman with Alzheimer's disease who had been enrolled in one of Naraxon's clinical trials. Mrs. Thompson had been one of the patients whose death had been hidden from the FDA, classified as unrelated to the study drug despite clear evidence of cardiac complications. Her daughter had written to thank me for exposing the truth about her mother's death and for preventing other families from experiencing the same loss. Dr. Rodriguez, the letter read, my mother trusted that the medication she was taking was safe. She trusted that the doctors and researchers involved in her care had her best interests at heart. Your courage in exposing the truth about Naraxon has restored my faith in the medical profession and ensured that other families won't have to endure what we went through. Thank you for putting patients before profits. That letter reminded me why I'd chosen to blow the whistle on Cascade Pharmaceuticals. It wasn't about revenge against Marcus Blackwood or Dr. Vance, though their downfall had been satisfying. It wasn't about the financial rewards that came with successful whistleblower cases, though the settlement had been substantial. It was about the fundamental principle that patients' lives matter more than corporate profits, and that those of us entrusted with their care have an obligation to protect them from harm. The pharmaceutical industry had learned a hard lesson from the Cascade scandal. Companies now faced much stricter oversight of their clinical trials, and executives knew that hiding safety data could result in criminal prosecution and personal liability. The culture of secrecy and profit at all costs that had enabled the Naraxon fraud was slowly being replaced by a new emphasis on transparency and patient safety. But vigilance would always be necessary. As long as there were billions of dollars to be made from pharmaceutical sales, there would be executives willing to cut corners and hide inconvenient truths. That's why whistleblowers like me were essential. We served as the last line of defense between corporate greed and patient safety. As I prepared for my next lecture on research ethics, I thought about the students who would soon fill my classroom. They were the future of medical research, the ones who would develop the next generation of life-saving treatments. My job was to ensure that they understood not just the science of clinical trials, but the moral obligations that came with the privilege of conducting research on human subjects. The Cascade pharmaceutical scandal had ended my career in the pharmaceutical industry, but it had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I'd stood up for what was right when it mattered most. I'd protected vulnerable patients from a dangerous drug, exposed systematic fraud at one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, and helped create a safer, more transparent system for drug development. In the end, that was worth more than any corner office or corporate title. It was worth more than the financial security I'd given up or the professional relationships I'd lost. It was the knowledge that when faced with a choice between personal advancement and moral obligation, I'd chosen correctly. The war against pharmaceutical fraud would continue, fought by regulators, journalists, attorneys, and whistleblowers like me. But the battle for Naraxon was over, and the patients had won. 16,000 lives had been saved, and the pharmaceutical industry had been reminded that some things are more important than profit margins and stock prices. As I looked out at the university campus, watching students hurry to their classes and researchers heading to their laboratories, I felt a deep sense of purpose. This was where I belonged, not in a corporate boardroom, but in an academic setting where the pursuit of knowledge was guided by ethical principles rather than financial incentives. The fluorescent lights in my office hummed softly overhead, a familiar sound that reminded me of my years at Cascade. But unlike that corner office on the 32nd floor, this space represented hope rather than corruption, transparency rather than secrecy, and the promise that the next generation of researchers would be better prepared to face the ethical challenges that came with the power to heal or harm. The whistleblower's work was never truly finished, but for now, justice had been served. Cascade Pharmaceuticals was gone, its executives were in prison, and Nuraxin would never reach the market. Most importantly, the patients who would have been harmed by that dangerous drug were safe, protected by the courage of those willing to speak truth to power. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.